Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. As always, I am happy to be with you to talk about books, to have another author interview, all of those wonderful things that we do in our times together. I hope you had a good weekend. My weekend was sort of discombobulating in that things kept getting rescheduled, partly my fault, partly just random circumstances. Just a lot of things kept getting moved around, and so I spent the whole weekend being slightly confused as to when things were scheduled, but it all worked out, and it was a lovely weekend. We had a friend who was in town over the weekend, visiting from Germany. Yes, the part of the group of friends that we translate charades with, and it's always fun. But he took us to a resort about 15 minutes from where we live for coffee and dessert one day, and it was lovely. It was a gorgeous day. There was this adorable little bird that clearly is used to people sitting outside and eating desserts, because it came and just hopped on our table and ate cake off of my husband's finger. It was so cute. And then it pooped on our table, of course, but it was still adorable. And then this resort had tiles. You know how I love tiles here, but it also had a room that was completely lined on 3 walls with books, big comfy leather armchairs, big squashy pillows. The books were wallpaper. It was a room of lies, just wallpaper. I was so sad by the wallpaper. It was really cool wallpaper, but it was still not bookshelves full of books. It was wallpaper. And then I was sad and don't want to go that. No, I'm kidding. I'll go back to that resort just to hang out with that cute little bird, but I won't sit in the book lie room. At any rate, speaking of books, not lies, speaking of books, I have, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I have author Coco Picard joining me today to talk about her novel, The Healing Circle. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book. A mother abandons her family in California to pursue a miracle cure in Munich. Once she gets there, however, she wonders if she might have already died. Bedridden with a terminal diagnosis, memories, nurses, immoral doctors, foreign television broadcasts, and phone calls from children intrude upon her consciousness. An aloe plant called Madame Blavatsky is her primary companion. That's the whole description of The Healing Circle, The Healing Circle by Coco Picard. And I'm kicking myself right now because I forgot to ask about Madame Blavatsky, the aloe plant. Yes, I now want to name a plant something very crazy like Madame Blavatsky, and I forgot to ask Coco about that. So that's a spoiler alert, not about the book, but about the interview that I did not ask that question, so you will not hear more about Madame Blavatsky in this interview. Sadness, but that is the description. It is very, as you can see from just that brief description of the book, you know it's not going to be your typical straightforward novel. That sentence. Once she gets there, however, she wonders if she might already have died. You know this is going to be a little, well, it's non-linear. It is not told in kind of your traditional, even with flashbacks and those sorts of things, it's still, you don't always know that you've jumped to a different time as you're reading, so you kind of live in that moment with Mother she's in Munich, but she's with her children. She's in the past, she's with her mother, she's with her family. She's just, you never quite know where you are, and you kind of get that feeling of, that surreal feeling that maybe she is also having in this experience in Munich. So I'm going to go ahead and now turn to the interview so that you can hear Coco tell about this story, how it evolved, why she wanted to write in this fashion, etc. So again, the book is called The Healing Circle. The author is Coco Picard. Let's turn to that interview. Hi, Coco. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to have you to talk about The Healing Circle. Before we get to the book, though, if you would take a moment just to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer and a cartoonist and an art curator, and I guess I'm not from the Midwest, but I spent about 17 years in Chicago, which were really formative. And during that time, I did get an MFA in writing, but was also and primarily running a nonprofit art space and publishing house called the Green Lantern, and was curating exhibitions and just really involved in a lot of the I don't know, independent arts and culture life there in the city. And I left Chicago, I guess it was right after or right before the pandemic. I moved to Santa Fe for a few years with at the time, I think my daughter was 1 or 1.5, and my husband, and we lived there for a few years. That's where I was working on the Healing Circle primarily. And then we all moved to Oxford with now my youngest son as well, England, in September. And I'm in a master's program for Tibetan and Himalayan studies. So that's sort of like in a nutshell.
Wow. So I moved to Portugal almost a year ago, but I moved with dogs, not small children. How was moving with small children?
I guess I don't know how else it would have, I can't, it's hard. It's sort of like, maybe this, I bet
Your
it's the
reality.
same with dogs. Like, I feel like your whole situation and scenario is so tightly organized around the constraints that you have and like the freedoms that those constraints allow also, that, it seemed okay. I also feel like it was like, I think it was also one of the hardest things that I've had to do. But it doesn't feel like it's necessarily about the family structure, but of course it is. You know what I mean? Just kind of, I remember when I feel like in my 20s, I had this idea that I moved around all the time, and it seemed fairly easy. Although in hindsight, I bet that it was more complicated than I realized. So I also think in some ways I'm old enough that I understand the toll that these decisions take, basically.
Yeah, I've moved a lot as well, but it's a little more complicated. And I just realized the other day that I really miss my junk drawer. How silly is that?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, there was something like that. I feel like I the other day I ended up missing this Indian restaurant in Santa Fe, which I think is funny because at the time I was like, oh yeah, this is okay, but you know what I mean? It was just like a habitual, it wasn't the best Indian food. It was just this like habit that we got into.
The comfort in a way.
Yeah. Which also, it felt like this like really deep treat in the middle of the pandemic when we weren't doing much, So
sure.
Yeah, I definitely get it. I like your junk drawer though. I think that's better.
I joked that one suitcase, if I move to another country, will just be my junk drawer contents.
Oh yeah. You're like, here, customs, have at it.
Yeah. Exactly. But okay, we are here to talk about a book, not about moving. So if you could give an overview of The Healing Circle.
The Healing Circle is a novel written in very short vignettes, and they're mostly achronological, and it's written from the perspective of a woman who has left her family. She's an older woman, and she's left her family, in search of a miracle cure after getting a terminal diagnosis. And so she ends up in this German hospital. And it's almost like she's stuck in bed and she can't move. And she's reliving her whole life as though it is happening at once, I would say.
It reads at times a little bit like a fever dream almost. Did you start out writing it linearly, or did that kind of evolve with the writing? Did you start out that way?
I mean, I think it's tricky on the one hand because like I had been working on the book for about like 10 years, I think, picking it up and putting it down and picking it up. But I also feel like there was this really intense period of working on it. I kind of finally arrived at a final draft, I want to say in like 2019. And then I applied to this Bookends fellowship program through Stony Brook. And for the next year was really editing it intensely. And so definitely by the time I arrived at that final draft, it was achronological. And I was interested in that because I guess I was trying to think about just like I think novels and narrative fiction is really good at playing with time and how time happens or occurs. And I guess I think that there's this like more standard idea, or maybe it's just like the more standard way of experiencing life where we feel like it's very linear and it goes from A to B. But for me, one of the things that I've encountered, the older I get, the more that I realize the past is like interrupting my present self with these associations that sometimes are very vivid and, really influence my experience of the present. And so I wanted to see if I could enhance that experience in a novel, basically. Mm-hmm. So I think basically like once the novel started to come into itself, it became organized around that idea. There's also this really amazing, I don't know, I think it's an amazing, I think it's like I don't remember if it's a Greek myth or a Roman myth. I think it comes up in the Aeneid maybe, but there's this myth about the Cumaean Sibyl, and she records her like visions for the future, but maybe also the past, I can't remember, on like leaves. And then she writes all this stuff on leaves, and then she just like puts these leaves in a big pile outside of her doorstep. And then people have to go and collect those leaves because otherwise the wind will come and reshuffle everything and it gets totally confused. And so I think that idea was something that I kind of wanted to see if I could play with that somehow.
Mm-hmm. Jumping in here, now that you've heard a little bit more about the premise of the book, we are going to take our first break. When we come back, a little bit more about writing in this non-linear fashion. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Coco Picard about her novel, The Healing Circle. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
In the writing or editing process, did you have a linear timeline in your head, or were you able to keep things straight as you were writing?
There was definitely a certain point when I had to make it, I had to make some rules, I think. And that was, that's what I worked on hardest, I think. during the last like year and a half of editing. I feel like at that point the novel was very much more spare. Like I think it was maybe half as long. And it was entirely achronological. And so then part of what I had to do was identify, like essentially there's like a fictive present in the book, which is the main character, the mother character in the hospital room. And there was a certain point that I realized that didn't have that, like that could actually be chronological, and that keeping that chronological would kind of, it sort of like becomes the backbone of the book, or that's how I was thinking about it. And then there are these other kind of pockets of memories that are sort of clustered around ideas. And essentially because I realized that if I was trying to write a totally achronological novel, I mean, in some ways it might not be true to the way we experience life, but also it was not creating like, I think it was ungenerous to readers. Like I wanted the reader to know where they were along the process, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What then was your initial inspiration for the story?
When I was, I guess probably actually when I was 9, my mother was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she sort of lived in and out of remissions until I was in my early 20s. And sort of over the course of that process was really interested in different types of new age medicine. And I think when she felt like Western medicine was really letting her down, she would kind of try and explore these other alternatives. And so that, I mean, it's funny because I think the mother in the book is very she doesn't really resemble my mother at all, but a lot of the what do I want to say? It's like a lot of her impetus comes from my own experience. My mother also, at a certain point, got a terminal diagnosis and went to Munich to do this cure thing. And so I think I also, I wanted to think about what it meant to be in that type of a position, be faced with that dilemma, or that diagnosis from a doctor, and then to just go away, you know what I mean, to go off on this other kind of ill-advised caper. It seems interesting to me, for all sorts of reasons, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, it's she leaves her family and goes to Munich to pursue this cure, which some people could perceive as selfish, but on the other hand, her children are grown and she's trying to save her own life in whatever way she can. So she presents that kind of interesting dichotomy that people sometimes encounter. Is it really selfish when you're putting yourself first? What about Mother as the main character do you think might resonate with readers?
I mean, I think my hope is what you're describing is of interest, because I think that became, I mean, I guess I don't know how other people write or find their way through completing novels. But I think for me, a lot of the early writing wasn't successful because I didn't really know the question that I was asking. And then there was a certain point where I feel like I kind of landed where what you describe, or landed in what you describe, which is like this, like, on the one hand, I think Mother isn't I mean, I don't know, maybe she's like funny, but she's not entirely likable. I don't know that she's a good mother, which is also something I was interested in. And her kids are grown, but she's still kind of identified primarily as mother, quote unquote. And so there's a way where I think it makes her seem especially selfish because she's like, quote unquote, abandoning her kids to do this thing. She's like spending their inheritance to do this thing. But then at the same time, I think there are a lot of really interesting questions about agency and wellness and how you find, what do I want to say, a sense of power within, especially like chronic unhealth, you know? And I guess there was something else I was thinking about too, like she's been living with this disease for so long, that I think there's a way where she's it's not just a physical physical illness, like it's sort of become wrapped up in her emotional well-being, her spiritual well-being. She's sort of like looking for anything that will give her a sense of happiness, I think, and fulfillment, and kind of conflating that with getting over this disease. And that's sort of like how she makes friends. And so I mean, I guess my hope is that that would be of interest to readers, because maybe it resonates with sort of parallel experiences.
Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting question because she is only identified as mother throughout the book. And it's often a different perception if it's a man or a father who were to do something that, if a mother does it, is seen as selfish. And if a father does it, it's not necessarily seen as selfish. So that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like I hadn't thought about this before, but it would be really funny, for instance, if to imagine a parallel novel where it's about a father who's, who decides at the last minute to go hike Mount Everest, you know what I mean? And I feel like in some way that would be more understandable. But for the mother character, this might be equivalent somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What kinds of research did you do for the book?
I was thinking about this question. I feel like it's sort of, I don't know, the way I work and write, I feel like it's always constant, but I don't have specific endeavors. I mean, I think obviously in this case, so much of it was based on experience, but a lot of that research was sort of just happening in the background of my life for many years. But then I also think that there are a lot of ways where, like in my own work as a curator, I also spent 20 years talking to artists, like visual artists, about why they made the work they made, and one of the things that I think is really interesting with a lot of the artists that I love most, there's always this really deep, I almost want to say it's like a translation process, or there's often a deep translation process where there's something, their life has been inflected by some personal event or personal experience or political situation or identity situation. Could be any number of things, but then the work that they make, that they might present in a gallery, is totally different and has a different, there isn't like an immediately obvious direct correlation, but then when you talk to them, or if you think about the work for long enough, you start to see how it's almost like the personal experience gets metabolized and transformed into this like alternate experience, visual or aesthetic experience. And I guess I feel like a lot of my work is inspired by that kind of process. Maybe I'll just mention one example. There was an exhibition at the gallery that I ran in Chicago by an artist called Stephen Laptissapon, and he is a legally blind painter, and does a lot of installation work where he'll paint with like coffee grounds or charcoal or turmeric. A lot of times there's sort of a food-based aspect to his work. And there was like in the show that he presented at My Space, he called it an egg bell, and there was like the top of an egg that he had dusted, I think, with some sort of bronze or gold dust, and it was hanging from a string. And it was the sort of thing where we were always warning people, like the audience, to sort of pay attention to this egg bell. And one of the things that I loved seeing, and in talking to Stephen, it was something that he really appreciated too. But it was almost like you would have a conversation with everybody, like an audience that was sitting down listening, getting ready to listen to a poetry event or something, poetry reading, and you'd say, okay, this is this artwork, this is this delicate sculpture, like just be aware. And everyone would nod and kind of I don't know, I think admire it to some extent or whatever. It would sort of start a conversation. But then it was amazing to see how quickly that egg bell would disappear the minute everybody's attention had turned. And so all of a sudden you would see people get up and like turn and bump the egg bell. And so I felt like I was seeing this little object kind of become visible and invisible sort of at random. And I was like, oh, Stephen, I get it. This is amazing. Like you're making us see space in a different way.
We're going to take our second break of this episode, but I just want to pop in here and say that I never know, and that's one thing that I love about speaking with different people. I never know what direction questions are going to take us in terms of the answers that people give. And sometimes those answers are just fascinating. Like I would not have expected the answer about the art exhibit, but I love that that's where Coco went, and in that description and the way her thinking evolved about space or the lack thereof, or seeing things in different ways. It's fascinating to me. So I really appreciate that the answers to questions I ask sometimes take different directions than I personally might expect, which is awesome because because unpredictability can be really interesting sometimes. So I like that. Let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, more with Coco. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Coco Picard. I hope that my last comment before break made sense, because after I said it, I don't know, it sounded like it went in a weird direction in my head. So I hope it made sense. It really was a positive comment about how some answers take an unexpected turn for me, and I like that they go in different directions. So hopefully that made sense. If not, I'm not going to keep hashing it out because I'm just going to talk myself into some kind of weird corner. Let's go back to the interview.
So then, how about in terms of your characters and the development of your characters? Do you have a good idea of those characters before you start, or did they really evolve more as you wrote?
I think I write towards them, but I also think that there's this funny way, and maybe it's related to having worked on it for so long. Like there's a kind of luxury in like long long, many years long projects. But I also think it can be a little bit maddening because you can kind of keep changing things forever. But I feel like in the case of this book, there was a moment where it's almost like everybody started having their own, or the appropriate amount of gravitational force. So like the constellation of characters, there was a moment where it's almost like planets, like they sort of like clicked in and started moving in the right way in relation to one another. But I think a lot of that had to do with figuring out that fictive present timeline, for instance, and figuring out how the mother character could remain central and relatively static, but still have a dynamic storyline. And then thinking a lot through different forms of, I don't know, I guess different, like the different things that the kids would be managing in their own right, and in their own lives, and how to point to the fact that they have their own lives that are running concurrently and that are inflected by their mother's experience in different ways.
In terms of story or characters or places, do you include any autobiographical elements in your writing?
I definitely do. But I also think I scramble it a lot. And there's something, I mean, I guess this raises a good question about authenticity, I think. And I feel like, or I have a sense of obligation or something to write towards an authenticity. But I also feel like sometimes I think the most authentic writing is actually not factually or like biographically accurate. So in my experience, I was with my mother at this hospital, and I have siblings, and we were taking turns taking care of her. And so in some ways it was a very different experience, but I think I spent the first 5 years of trying to write this book from the perspective of like a version of myself. And I think I actually feel like it was impossible to have I don't know, like an authentic voice or something. And then when I was able to in some ways, I feel like when I was actually able to displace my own ego and stop worrying about trying to convince a reader of how I personally was feeling, which happened to be connected to moving the protagonist into the mother's body, then I feel like all of a sudden I could write the book.
Yeah, interesting how you never quite know what is gonna be that clicks into place for you in terms of this process. Yeah.
And also like and yeah, so I feel like it's like going back to your question, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of biographical parallels between like my own life and what happens in the book, but also like the book that has emerged is totally different. And it's almost like, I think I've thought about this almost like it's like the reality of my experience in my 20s, like had a dream, and this is the book that happened, kind of.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Well, you spent a while on this one. So if this is a too soon question, I apologize, but are you working on anything new now?
I am, and hopefully it won't take as long. Yeah, I'm working on I'm working on a parody. It's sort of like there's a mixed identity or mistaken identity parody about an art curator who gets invited on a creative influencer tour by mistake, and then it sort of becomes like a spy thriller. That's the idea. So it's been a lot of fun to work on that, actually.
Fun. Thank you. Um, in terms of writing, is it something, writing for publication in this case, is it something that you always wanted to do, or did you come to that decision later in life, or how did that process work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always wanted to be a writer, like very, very much. But I think it took me a really long time to find my voice, I guess. And I think it's another one of those ways where like I'm the sort of person who is constantly writing and constantly working on long form fiction, but in some ways I feel like it's the last thing to have been published. Like I've written a lot of art criticism and some not creative some creative nonfiction essays, some just essays. But I think it took me a long time to find my footing as a novelist. And maybe part of that is because it did take me a long time to kind of find, I don't even want to say it's like my voice, but to find voice. Like I feel like I think for a long time I was trying to write like other people. And then it's a pretty exciting experience to kind of suddenly land in a place where you feel more sure-footed.
I can kind of understand. I mean, when I think about some of my favorite books or my favorite authors and the voices within those, I would maybe want to not recreate, but kind of emulate them because I like how they sound or how they feel in my head when I read them. But you still have to find your voice and how your writing style works.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think like figuring out what kind of risks are like your risks, I guess. Like I think a lot of times the authors that I really love, the risks, like I love them because they're taking certain risks, but they're not, I don't think ultimately those were mine. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from your own experience, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Keep writing. It's like everybody says. I think, yeah, keep writing, find your community. I also think, I think that there's a big, I guess as somebody who was like writing privately for so long, and of course I have a number of or I shouldn't say a number. I have a few very generous friends that have over the years read drafts. But I think there's something really amazing about being in a position where you can suddenly take that writing seriously. And for me it was the kind of the confluence of winning the Red Hen Women's Prose Award and then also getting into this Bookends Fellowship. And I feel like that really felt to me like this moment where I was like, oh, I am a writer, I am this type of writer. Um and being able to have that year, I mean, of course I was like raising kids and doing freelance work, but I was also, because I was like in this program and meeting so regularly with fellow writers with whom I was editing the book, and then also I was meeting with my mentor Meg Wolitzer. And I feel like there was something about being in that situation where I was taking my writing seriously in a new way. And I think it was great. And obviously, I think there's different ways to kind of find a scenario like that. Like, I think that happened to be my way, but I also think it's possible to do create more organic scenarios with a specific group of friends or writers. But I don't know. That's what I would say. Figure out how you have to take it seriously, because it's a really meaningful it's meaningful to do, and I think it's also meaningful for others to read. And I think it's like carpentry. Like, I think it's really just takes practice. Like, you really, I mean, I guess I'm not a carpenter, but so I shouldn't make an assumption, but I think it's really like you're like learning about the medium of words, and there's like mathematical elements and formal elements and aesthetics. And so I think you really have to just like work on it to kind of figure out what you like to do with it, like with the medium.
And I think having other people who, in some way, however that is, that hold you accountable, is probably helpful, because some people are, I'm sure, wonderful at keeping on task and holding themselves accountable, but having that outside force sometimes can help you to just stay a little more focused.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Time for the final break of the episode. When we come back, Coco will be talking about her favorite authors and genres. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Coco Picard.
When you take time to read for yourself, who are your favorite authors and what are your favorite genres?
I feel like I don't know. I'm really excited by I don't know, my list at the moment. And I don't have a lot of time to read, so it's sort of often in these like small bursts where I pick things up and put things down. But I love Atessa Moshfegh. I love Azarine van der Vliet Alumi. I love Amina Kane and Adanya Shibli. I feel like her book, A Minor Detail, it's like every sentence and every word is like in its perfect place, and it's such a slight book, but it carries it's like there's so much just violence and constriction, and it's just, I don't know, a stunning work. And then I love I feel like I read Olga Tarkachuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was this sort of thing where I was like reading this book. Like, I love murder mysteries and I love, spy stuff. And so then I sort of feel like I was reading this book that was like the book that I wish had been written, and it's like I found it. If you have that sort of experience where you're like, oh, I just really hope that my romantic partner is available somewhere in the world, if you haven't met them yet. And then all of a sudden it's like that was the equivalent of this book, and I picked it up and I started reading it. It was like, oh, this is it. It's amazing. Yeah, I feel like that's sort of where I am right now.
We talked about what you're reading. Is there anything fun that you're reading with your children right now?
Oh, yeah, we have this great, it's like, I love it actually. There's this amazing series of books called Cheery and Cheera by Kaya Doi. And I mean, I think there might be like four or five of them. I don't know. They're so good. They're basically about these like two friends who live together and they go on bicycle rides, and they just go to different kinds of parties. But it will be like, I mean, the one that I think we just read, the one, it's like, I think it's called In the Night, and they go I've only read it once, so I can't remember all the details, but I feel like it's a perfect example. They go to the woods, they find these cats. There's all these cats that are having parties. The cats are like, here, like, drink some tea. You know what I mean? It's some like amazing tea or something. Like it would be like pumpkin spice tea or something. And then slowly Cheery and Chira become cats also. And then they all go to a pond with these cats with like lanterns. And then like at the end, Cheery and Chira become people again and ride back to their home and on their bicycles. And essentially like each one of these books has the same structure where they meet different types of animals, and the animals are like, come to this hot spring with us, and they all have hot springs. And one of the things that I love about it is just thinking about how this is like a version of I lived in Philadelphia in my 20s briefly, and I feel like it's a version of being a Philadelphia hipster where you like ride your bike to different parties, except these two, for whatever reason, they get to go hang out with animals.
I love it. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but perfect for small children.
It's so good.
Yeah.
And like there's no death. There's no like everybody's so nice.
Right. Sometimes you just need that.
Lots of things to eat. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. How about internet presence? Do you have a website, and what social media can people find you on?
I do. I'm on Instagram at Coco Larolo. I was on Twitter, but I haven't been on for a really long time. Which I miss it actually, but I don't know. It seems kind of like a strange space at the moment. And then I'm also on Facebook, but very, very rarely. And that's, I think, under Caroline Picard. I have a website where people can also reach me at cocolarolo.com. And I think that's it. Maybe I'm sorry, it's cocopicard.com. And yeah, that about sums it up.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've talked about a variety of different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe this is kind of going back a step. But it's maybe like, I don't know, conflating different questions that you had. But another book that was really influential to me was 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. And I mean, there was something I was really interested in writing a novel that was like significantly smaller, or just, I mean, not necessarily than Bolaño's book, but like if you're going to write a great novel, like what if it is not like 5,000 pages, But so I had been thinking a lot about Bolaño's work, and then a friend of mine brought me to see like a staging of his play of a play version of 2666, and it was also, I think it was like 6 hours long or something. It was sort of like similarly like very, very, very long. And in the play, one of the things that struck me was that there was a female actor who had to pretend to be a dead body, or pretend she was like acting, just lying on stage for a really long period. And so I think that was something that I thought a lot about in my book, just like the idea of what if the female body is also just can't move and is sort of stuck in the gaze of the narrative. But it was also there was like a moment where I saw one of the actors from this play at like a Whole Foods supermarket much later. And that's something that kind of is recounted in the novel.
Mm-hmm.
But having that happen, I feel like that was like another moment where I was like, oh, I know what this book is about, kind of. And it's sort of about that, like recognizing the actor, but the actor is somebody who like plays this this Archambaldi character who is so central to the 2666 book, and thinking about how characters, like people in our lives, become like how they end up representing history in different ways, and how that history like passes through families and sort of refracts through us. Anyway, that was also something that was just interesting to me to think about.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking the time. I know you have a cold, so thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the Healing Circle and writing.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you once again to Coco for taking the time to talk to me, not only about the Healing Circle, but about writing and the process that went into writing this particular book and everything that we covered. I really appreciate her time. She had a bit of a cold, so I was grateful that she was able to work through that. I know that talking to someone, or talking in general when you have a cold, is not always easy. I have been there. You've heard me be there a million times with sinus infections and everything. So thank you to Coco for powering through and talking to me about the Healing Circle. Of course, as always, if this is a book that sounds interesting to you, you should definitely check it out. And when you do, write a review, leave a review, comment, post it on social media, do all those things that help authors. I know that they appreciate it. But, if you are interested in books that are kind of this non-linear, almost surreal books, or really if you want to read about Madame Blavatsky, because you knew I had to work that in one more time, right? I had to say it one more time. I'm teasing. But this is not your maybe typical novel, and maybe you're looking for something a little bit different to read, and you are intrigued by the nature of this novel and the content and all of the things that we talked about during our time together, then you should definitely go find yourself a copy to read. As always, thank you to Coco. Thank you to you, my listeners, for joining me. If you are a fan of this podcast, I'm going to say it as I always do. Just as you leave reviews for your authors and the books that you read, if you can leave a review of this podcast, it is really helpful. Written or starred, either way works. Also, make sure that you're following the podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on, so that you can get episodes when they come out. We have 2 episodes this week. I did 2 interviews, so join me on Friday's episode for my interview with author Linda Hurtado Bond about her thriller, All the Broken Girls. I'll be talking with her about that, and you can listen to that episode on Friday. But following on whatever platform you listen on will give you notifications anytime there is a new episode. And then, of course, follow on social media, comment, let me know what you're up to, what you're reading. You can find the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from you. Hope you're having a great week. It is already February. I cannot believe it is already the end of January, the beginning of February. We are a month into 2023. I don't know where the time is going. I keep seeing posts on Facebook or other social media saying, that January is on its 477,000th day or something silly, crazy. And I get that. I've been there, but this January has just gone so super fast. So regardless if it's gone fast or slow, welcome to a new month, and whatever you're doing this month, I hope it involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in lots of great books. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.